I'm a professor in the Department of Theater and Communications at San Antonio College. It's my privilege to be here today with Professor Emeritus John Igo, also of San Antonio College. John will complete in May of 1999 his 45th year of teaching at San Antonio College and is arguably the most well-known professor in all of San Antonio. John is a true scholar and a Renaissance man in an age of specialization. He is a scholar of literature, of theater history. He is also a radio and television personality and has been for many years in San Antonio. He is our best-known theater critic, and he is a nationally anthologized poet and has been published numerous times. Today, John is going to tell us about theater history in San Antonio, and basically I'm going to ask one question and sit back and listen to his narrative about theater history. So, John, tell us about theater history in San Antonio.
I thought you'd never ask. I said, where does one start? I have a footnote that I'm going to put at the very beginning. There's nothing like distortion of the physique just to get this in. I want to talk about Los Pastores, the Mexican Christmas pageant drama, so that I can use that as a paragraph and set it aside. It has been performed in San Antonio, so far as we can tell, roughly since the 1790s. And it's performed every Christmas season. Each troupe does 24 performances, and there were sometimes as many as 8 or 10 troupes going, so that we have 25,000. It has been estimated as many as 150,000 performances of Los Pastores. But of course that's for the Spanish-speaking people and tourists who get to the mission for the Conservation Society sponsorship. But that's a lot of theater. But it's also religious ritual. So I'm going to remove that from the discussion. I just wanted to get that in. Most people don't know that we have a show that has now been performed 100,000 times.
Was that a script of any kind?
Multiple scripts. A man named Rael, R-A-E-L, from University of Arizona, went searching and found 70-some different scripts. And of those, only 3 he located in Texas, and that insulted me. Mm-hmm. So I went off and did some research and found 25 to 27 more. Mostly at Our Lady of the Lake, but I found others. Mm-hmm. And wrote to him, and he said, good, he's going to add them. So now we have over 100 versions of Los Pastores that we know of. Printed text, and lots of them are performed without printed text, so there are really more words available than there are in the 100 printed texts.
Was the original script Spanish-European, or what were the roots?
Mexican.
Mexican.
People try to trace it back to Spain, and I went back and, with a dictionary, read the one from Spain, and there's almost no connection. I mean, it has the same name. It's called Los Pastores, Lope de Vega, but nothing. And there's another one by Calderón de la Barca. No, it's just mostly the name. The thing that we know really got started in central Mexico. Some well-educated monk decided he was going to illustrate that particular part of the Bible by dramatizing it. And evidently it was a kind of idea, not an idea, but a kind of idea whose time had come. So it just went all over. We can find them in Southern California, Southern Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and within about 100 miles of the river, all the way down to the Gulf. And in Mexico, northern Mexico, some in central, but not much. It's the biggie, but we're not going to talk about that. It has outperformed everything else combined. Everything that I'm going to talk about just disappears in comparison. However, the history of theater in San Antonio, as we think about it, really started probably with the Texas Revolution. We had lots of Irish, we had lots of German. Of course, we had the Mexican, and all of them wanted entertainment. Some of them wanted actual theater. But we don't have much information, documented information. So Dr. Charles Myler of St. Mary's University was the chairman of the drama department, has since retired. Did some research, maybe for his doctorate, I don't know, and came up with a map of theaters in San Antonio between statehood, 1845, and the Civil War, and produced a map, 24 inches wide and 18 inches high, and on there with the downtown streets as a grid, he located 15 to 20 theaters. Now, most of those were entertainment. I don't know that they were cabaret, but they were mostly entertainment. But some of those were legitimate theater. 1850, we know of a dramatic production, but from 1845 to the Civil War. And that's a lot of theaters in a city the size of San Antonio at that time.
Was there a theater district? Was there a particular place in San Antonio?
No, just mostly just downtown, easy access, along Flores Street, along St. Mary's, Presa. You know, St. Mary's south of downtown used to be Garden, and there was a Water Street and whatever. But they were all downtown, within walking distance. But of course, San Antonio was within walking distance. There were only about 25,000 people at that time. Well, he located all that, but he also did some magic work, and I don't know how he got inspired. He worked on what we have known as the Grand Opera House of San Antonio. It was on Alamo Plaza, facing the Menger, roughly. For those of you with that kind of memory, in recent days it was H.L. Green or Neisner's. I can never keep those two names straight. Corner of Crockett and Alamo. In fact, that wax museum thing is in there now. And you go out into the street, which is dangerous, but after all, a little theater research. You go out into the street and you look up at the top of the building. Up there, you can see what looks to be a square, or at least rectangular, building on top of the building. That's the old stage house.
The original structure.
The original. They changed everything inside, but they didn't see any reason for taking that down. They could use it for storage. So that's where all of the pulleys used to be to pull the curtains, and all of the big sand drops to counterbalance and all that stuff. All that went through there on a system of pulleys, and it's still there. You can still go and look at the place where it used to be.
Was it a counterweight fly system that they had?
Yeah.
Really?
And the people who came there were the big names. Edwin Booth played there several times. Joseph Jefferson with his Rip Van Winkle. James O'Neill, the father of Eugene. I can't document this, but legend says that Bernhardt was there and Eleonora Juza was there. I know, because of a family bit of history, that Lillian Russell, La Tub, the great one with the beautiful face and the beautiful voice and a 54-inch waist, sang there. People would come through San Antonio and go to the Grand Opera. Charlie Myler did research and started collecting programs, and they are now in the San Antonio part of the theater archive, in the History, Texas, and Genealogy section on the 5th floor at the public library. It's a separate collection. Everything that anybody has ever been able to find about the Grand Opera, Charlie Myler gathered. And if he had done mean things, he would go to heaven just for that. I mean, it's beautiful.
What was the size of this opera house?
You mean the seating capacity?
Seating capacity, yes.
I'm having to work from oral report here, 450 to 600.
Wow.
About the size of what I call San Antonio Little Theater, San Pedro Playhouse, inside. And it was very interesting to me structurally, because entering off Alamo, one went through this areaway downstairs with shops and things on both sides and got to a staircase and went up the staircase and then turned back. And the auditorium was up there. And it was torn down about 1930, which puts it safely beyond any range that I would ever have. But my family members would tell me things. When I finally got sense enough to ask questions. You know, kids don't care. Where do we come from? Whatever became of so-and-so. But it's a strange child who says at age 8, did you ever go to the theater and how did you get up there and how much did the tickets cost and, you know, whoever. My mother saw Lillian Russell at the end of Lillian Russell's career because my mother was quite young.
It sounds like that opera house was the opera house in all the state of Texas. Was there anything in Dallas or Houston to compare or compete with that at that time?
No. There was almost nothing in Dallas, almost nothing in Houston. Houston's a latecomer. And Austin has since become very important. There were other opera houses. There was one in west of us. What's the name of the thing? Schulenburg is to the east. There was one in Schulenburg. They've just refurbished it. It's about 90 miles west of San Antonio, and I can't think of the name of the city. Beautiful Rococo opera house, but they were all small.
Is that going out in I-10, Ozona? That
No,
area?
no, 90 west.
90 West, Uvalde.
There's Castroville, Uvalde.
Okay.
You got it. Thank you. I knew that you'd serve some purpose. We had the opera house, and we had others, and I'll talk about those later. The map that Charlie Myler did really ends with the Civil War. Now that's blur. There is no such thing as we are now going to end everything because this is March 19th, 1862. There are overlaps and shortfalls and other things, but approximately. Then the great golden age of San Antonio theater, and that counts now, was from roughly 1860. Notice that it's before the Civil War, to World War II. That's when we were really big-time theater. We have to remember there were no films, no recordings of any kind. You could read or entertain yourself or get somebody to play the piano and sing along. There just really wasn't a great deal. Croquet. So we had theater. And I'm going to whip through. I have some notes here that are totally incomprehensible to anybody except me, and sometimes even to me. The great houses, the Grand Opera I have already talked about. And there was Beethoven Hall, which is still standing there. Bernhardt came there. There were some local productions there. The great actress Alla Nazimova came there in 1904 or 1905. And just coincidentally, that's where my mother had her stage career. She, as she always said, she was third from the left on the back row of the chorus. She did some work at Beethoven Hall when she was really a girl.
And Beethoven Hall is still downtown in Alamo Plaza.
Yeah.
Across the street from the Fairmont Hotel, is that right?
Yeah, still there. It's occupied right now by Magic Theater, Richard Rosen's most successful operation. It has been refurbished any number of times. It was redone sort of for Hemisphere. And then they ripped out all those gorgeous horseshoe boxes of which I was so fond. It really was the golden horseshoe, like a European theater. Slightly raked auditorium with posts or columns to hold up the other. And there was this horseshoe, a gallery, that went almost down as far as the stage. And they had the fiddleback chairs up there. These were not anchored seats. They were fiddleback chairs. And I loved it. I went to Hemisphere any number of times. And once you'd seen some of the exhibits, never need them again. But I went back and back and back. It was the Czechoslovakian exhibit called Kino something, or something Kino. Vladimir Marek, who later settled here to teach ballet, was here with the exhibit. And I went back and back mostly to look at the building. And people thought I was crazy because things are going on down front. And I was turning around, not staring at the people behind me who were making noise, but looking at the architecture. Then it was refurbished about 15 years ago. And then again, very recently, just before Rosen and his troops moved in. The space inside remains the same. The raking of the audience is different. The cantilevered stage is still there. It used to be very interesting. Cantilevered stage. Stand on that stage, and the audience would applaud or something, and the vibration would pick up under the cantilever so that you could not only hear the vibrations, the applause, and feel it that way, but you could also pick it up through your feet. And the legend goes that that's the one place in San Antonio that Helen Keller liked, because Helen Keller, blind and deaf, spoke to a group there, and she could pick up anything. The story goes that somebody got up to leave for some reason or other, and she paused. Now, this is a woman who is blind and deaf. Just paused, and they asked her, how did you know? And, well, she picked it up through the cantilevered stage. Well, and the Municipal Auditorium, that came later, came in the late 20s, evidently, around the same time as the Texas Theater. The Municipal Auditorium was far better than most people have wanted to remember. And then remember, it burned. Mm-hmm. And the public outcry was such that it was redone. The plan from City Hall, wouldn't you know, tear it down, let's make it a parking lot. That's the way city halls operate. But the voters, the public, simply decided, no, we want the auditorium. Well, when they put it back, they made changes. For those who haven't been back in since the fire, it comes as an interesting surprise, if not a jolt. The auditorium balcony area has been reconfigured, and the stairways that used to go up and down to the mezzanine are not there anymore, and the downstairs seats can now be seen from parts of the balcony, I'm going to call it, rather than the lower mezzanine, where they could not before. But the acoustics there were such that the San Antonio Symphony never had any problems there. And I saw live drama there with Raymond Massey and Baxter and Tyrone Power and others. Oh, Agnes Moorehead, one of my favorites. They were performing on stage there as theater, and we never had any problems. There was a pocket, about the first 10 rows downstairs, dead. And of course, that's where all the people wanted to buy the expensive seats. Those are the ones who didn't want theater, they wanted to be seen. So they would buy these expensive seats and put on the furs and all this good stuff and come and sit in the first 8 rows, and they didn't hear anything and they didn't care because they were seen before, and they were seen at intermission, and they were seen leaving with the tiaras and the furs and all of that good stuff. When it was rebuilt, somehow the acoustics were altered. The acoustics before the fire were better than they are now. So when the symphony says they really don't like to play at the auditorium, believe them.
What year was the fire?
Oh, I don't remember.
So you don't know what year it was
I'm going to say 1980, and it took them to 87 to get it rebuilt. I don't remember. But I grew up going to the auditorium, seeing children's plays, operettas, solo performances. The people who now come into the Majestic and now into the Empire used to come to the auditorium. Solo performances. I saw Burl Ives there. You remember Burl Ives? Okay. He had a chair and an acoustic guitar and a microphone on a stand, like 4-foot stand. That was it. And he kept us absolutely spellbound for an hour and a half. And then rather than take another 15 or 20 curtain calls, he said, all right, all right, all right, I'll do some more. So he went back out and gave us about another hour. Now, a voice like Burl Ives and a single stand microphone in that auditorium doesn't sound possible, but it worked. That's why I saw Victor Borge the first 2 or 3 times. You know, it was a useful space. And nowadays people say, oh, the acoustics are terrible. Well, they have all of that high-tech everything now and everybody talking to microphones and whatever. And it isn't as good as it was before the fire because they reconstructed it. If they had gone back to the original plans, it would have still worked. Anecdote about my career on that stage. The San Antonio Symphony was doing a fundraiser. And Marjorie Walsall, who was the head of the music department here, called me at home one Saturday and said, do you have a dark suit? And I said, yes. And she said, good, put it on and come to the auditorium. Click. Not can you, is it convenient? Do you mind? Would you cooperate? Nothing, just do it. So I showed up and asked her, what do I do? And she said, you're going to be selling raffle tickets. Well, I didn't mind selling raffle tickets because people there were perfectly willing to give money for the symphony. It was a fundraising night. So I expected there was going to be something like that. And she said, now when he points at you, that means that the microphone is open, and then you make the announcement. And I said, what microphone, and who's going to point at me, and where am I going to be? And she said, oh, you're going to be on stage. And I had not thought of that. And she said, and just make the announcement. I said, what announcement? And she said, you know, thank them for coming and tell them what the prizes are. I didn't even know that there was a raffle that night until I got there. And I said, what prizes? And she told me, and I carry little pieces of paper in my pocket. I can demonstrate that. Have for years. So I got out my little piece of paper and listed all of the things. And she said, the lights will go down, and that'll tell them to hush up. And then he will point at you, and that means that the mic is live, and then you come out on stage and do it. And I didn't want to. 4,400 alien people, all of them ready to kill me, sitting out there in the dark. And she said, yeah, go ahead and do it. And I said, I don't want to. And she said, you have to. So I stood in the wings, and after a while, the lights went down, and the man backstage pointed at me, and I didn't move. And Marjorie, standing behind me, literally shoved me this way. And I came out onto that stage, all elbows and knees. The audience loved it. Here was this fella being catapulted from backstage. And I came out to the microphone, and there it was, a cobra looking me straight in the face. And I recovered enough. And I did all the things that I was supposed to, except that I messed up the list. And it was supposed to start, the one thing that you can win is a ukulele. You can win a $10 whatever, a $25 gift certificate, a $50 radio or something, a $100 stole, $150 something else, $200 something else, and kept going. Stock in something or other, and the top one was a Cadillac. Well, when I got out there with the cobra staring at me, I started on the second one. You can get a $10 gift certificate. You can do whatever, $50 this, $100 stole, $150 something else, $250 piece of furniture, $500 something else, a Cadillac, or, and I thought I better not leave it out, so I said, or a ukulele. After I had just announced the Cadillac, well, the audience loved it. I mean, 4,400 people yelped approval, and with that, this is the truth. This is not interpretation. I broke and ran because I was not close to the curtain. I was 15 feet, 20 feet out. Well, when they boufed, I simply broke and ran, and they applauded, and they wanted me to come back for a curtain call. We sold thousands of dollars worth of raffle stuff that evening. So I have a connection with the auditorium, and It wounds me that it is not the same loving place that it was before, because it used to produce good sounds, except for those 8 rows or 10 rows. The best seat in the house at the auditorium forever was the 2nd row lower balcony. Ask me why 2nd.
Why 2nd?
Because the front row had the rail and some metal going up and a metal rail on top of it. And for those of us who are my size, sitting on the front row, you look at the stage and what you get is this metal bar all the way across.
It's still there too, isn't it?
Yeah. So the 2nd row over the top of the bar could see anything, hear anything. Good. Well, so much for the municipal auditorium. Local productions I need to talk about. This comes as a surprise to people. San Antonio for 50 years, give or take, don't count, was a production center of theater in this whole area. People were coming in from Uvalde and Granbury and from Austin and from whatever. Later, I'm told they came by train and by bus. I have no recollection of that. This is pre my time. But we had as many as 7 production companies going full-time simultaneously in competition with each other. And these were resident professional companies, full-time. The people had no other jobs. These were not amateurs. And we had, among others, later, Eddie Albert, Clark Gable and his first wife. They played with the Edna suddenly it's gone. Anyhow, there were 2 theaters on Alamo Plaza, one in the corner of what used to be Josky's, Dillard's now, and the other one was sort of across the street, the Palace. And those 2 people played in either or both of those. They were in real competition. San Antonio, with a population of around 50,000 at the time, ooching upward gradually to maybe 62,000, supported 7 or 8 resident theater companies. Remember, again, if there were any movies, they were the old Nickelodeon type, the black and white things that lasted 10 minutes and there was no sound and a lot of flicker and people got headaches and all that. They were purely entertainment. The really good silent films came later, the Chaplins and the Keatons and Lillian Gish and whatever. Oh, by the way, Lillian Gish has a San Antonio connection. Where the theaters were, I'm going to quote the title of a book by a man named Joseph Gallegly, a journalist who retired in Houston. He wasn't just a journalist there, but he retired in Houston. He did endless research. Another Charlie Myler. He just pillaged the universe to get it. His book is called From Alamo Plaza to Jack Harris's Saloon. Now, Jack Harris's Saloon was down by City Hall, give or take. And the map of San Antonio professional theater is roughly from City Hall. You can't really do that, you understand. But from City Hall, up Houston Street, Alamo Plaza, and down Commerce Street, back to City Hall. That's really where the theater district was. There were a couple just outside that, but that's where they were. For instance, Casino Hall. This is a bit of history for those of you who are curious. The Hertzberg Circus Collection, until about 10, 15 years ago, was the site of the San Antonio Public Library, in the San Antonio Library. I don't remember that. That's before my time. But running directly across the street from the Hertzberg over to Commerce Street, there was a tiny little street that came out alongside Shiloh's. You know where Shiloh's Delicatessen is? Okay.
Commerce, yes.
Yeah, there was a little street called Casino Street. So if you got on Commerce Street, you got on Casino Street, and you walked straight ahead, you walked into Casino Hall. Now, I remember Casino Hall. I'm not all that old, folks, but I remember it. Very good retentive memory when I was a kid asking millions of questions. Casino Hall went out of existence as a theatrical production place. It was the place that the city water board of San Antonio used to collect water bills. And people used to have to go there to pay their water bills if they didn't pay them by mail. And I can remember riding with some of my many aunts. They'd say, come on, we're going to go pay for the water. And the kids would pile into the car and go. And as I got older, one of my older cousins and I were allowed to take the money and the bill and go in and pay it and come back with a change. And it was in Casino Hall. It faced north, next door to where the Hertzberg is. They did German productions. They did some English, but that's not really what they were after. San Antonio was 1/3 German until World War I, and 1/3 English-speaking, and then 1/3 Spanish-speaking, and then you have some Italian and some Chinese and some whatever, which made inroads into some of those others. But the German population was very closely knit. St. Joseph's downtown, with the stained glass windows, still with German under the windows. The cornerstone is still in German. My great-grandfather helped build the walls. German masses. There were German printers, a German newspaper. The King William area, only it wasn't King William, it was Kaiser Wilhelm. The King William area and other pockets of German along Probant Street, where some of my ancestors lived. Very strong unification. We still have the Beethoven Männer Chor. We still have the German Society. We still have those Oompa bands that play there on Parita Street. We have some vestiges, but it's not there anymore as the way it was. So this house played to roughly a potential of 1/3 of the population of San Antonio, and it was the only one that was doing German. And by coincidence, you know, Mrs. Rosengren of Rosengren's bookstore used to say, God wanted you to have it. I ran into a little old lady, and when I call them little old ladies, they're old. Matilda Wiest, W-E-S-T. She was at least in her 70s, and I was probably in my 30s. So to me, that made her ancient. I mean, dinosaur. But she was a sweet, cooperative lady, and she said, come over. And she fed me some mint tea or something, and I got to listen to her, got to ask my million questions. Turns out that Matilda was the daughter of the Wiest who helped run this thing. And I asked her, do you have any copies of the scripts? And she said, oh, yes, but you wouldn't be interested there in German. I asked, do you have any copies of the programs? Oh, yes, well, we can get you some. So I got some programs from her, and they're in the theater archive. Casino theater programs from 1860, 1862, 1868, whatever. They did Goethe, and they did Schiller, and they did Grillparzer, the Austrian, and whatever, for our German audience. And very serious about theater. They also had Oompa bands on weekdays and stuff, but when they went theatrical, they weren't messing around. They weren't going to just throw together something entertaining. They really did it. Another was the Rialto.
Excuse me, John, how long did that theater survive?
Oh, till just before we paid water bills. Probably into the 1920s. I'm going to have to amend that. It probably died in World War I because everything turned anti-German.
So it went 30, 40 years.
Oh, yeah. Kunstmann Publisher had to close down because they threatened to kill him. My aunt, who was teaching in a German school, German aunt, one day they arrived and found an order that they had to use English only in the classroom, and that meant the teacher and the students, and many of them had never dealt with English before. And she had to use English or lose her job, and they had to speak English or get sent home, and that was in 1917. The newspaper shut down. Kaiser Wilhelm changed its name to King William. Wilhelmstrasse became William Street and whatever. So I'm just going to say that the casino died then. I don't know that that's when, but it's reasonable. It was around then. At least it was a result of that. Then there was the Rialto on Houston Street. Conflicting answers. One said that the Rialto faced what is now the Majestic, and the other one says the Majestic replaced the Rialto. So I don't know, but it was right there. And again, by coincidence, or as Burl Ives calls it, coinkydink, I met at the end of her career, the end of her life, a woman named Nora Dewson Hill. She was Nora Dewson. Her first performances in San Antonio that I know of were in the opening 2 or 3 seasons of the San Antonio Little Theater back in 1928, 29, 30, whatever. And she married and moved with her husband, moved away. And he didn't approve of her being an actress when he could take care of her and supply all the money. I mean, who needed a professional actress in the family? So according to her statement, she didn't act for 50 years. And then he died. She was here. They had come back before. He was working with Zachary, I think. But she told me, chuckling about it, she said, he would be gone for some time, and sometimes it was enough time for me to rehearse and be in a show, and he never knew it. You know, she wasn't going to stop. But officially, she returned to the theater with San Antonio Fine Arts Center. That was at the corner of Bitters and Nacogdoches. Long gone. And she came back and did a performance there, her first officially in 50 years. And then she went out to the Fiesta Dinner Playhouse, the one out on 1604 at 281, and auditioned. She walked in on Earl Holliman and said, I want to audition for the show, and said who she was and had her resume, which would dazzle anybody. And he said, if you want the role, you can have it. And she said, no, I came to audition. You don't know what you're going to be getting because you have other actors and other actresses, and their heights and their weights and their voices and things may be different, and maybe I'm not right for the role. Good pro. Absolutely. So he tried her out and said, yeah, you can have the role. Then she got pneumonia and couldn't do it. During rehearsal, she got pneumonia, and they flew in Irene Tedrow from the West Coast, so they did Arsenic and Old Lace without her, you know, and she never performed again. She never really recovered from that bout with pneumonia. 2 or 3 years of really just being frail, and she was gone. Well, she was at the Rialto. Then we had the Princess, Theater 1, and Princess, Theater 2. And we had the Wigwam, Theater 1 and Theater 2. And again, a personal connection. You wonder how I got involved with local theater? I have connections with this stuff all over the place. Years back, way back, I had some surgery. I was in the, what do they used to call it? M&S, and the P&S was across the street. It's Baptist now. Anyhow, the M&S Hospital. And one of my cousins, with whom I used to go pay the water bills, came to visit. And in those days, you could bring food into the hospital room. Nowadays, it's suspect. They really don't want you to. But she brought this wonderful basket of fresh fruit. And I asked her, where did you get it? And she said, I got it at the Wigwam. Didn't mean a thing to me. So when I was discharged and up and around and doing things again, I asked her, where is the Wigwam? And she said, It's just off Houston Street on Broadway, within a block or two. It's on the right-hand side if you're walking away from Houston. So I went to look, and there it was. It was a fruit and vegetable store downtown. It used to be like that. Walk through this sort of thing, looked like a lobby, and here was the stuff. They hadn't even really converted the theater. The stage was blocked off, and they had taken the seats out, and it had been a very gentle raking because the stage was up high, so that it didn't matter, you know. So I bought something just so that I could say I bought something at the Wigwam. It wasn't until 10, 15 years later, wait a minute, that was Wigwam too. That was a real theater. I had thought when I first walked in there that it had been a film house. Never occurred to me that was the famous Wigwam too. Well,
What kind of theater did they produce there originally in the Wigwam 1?
well, Wigwam 1 was somewhere else.
Oh, okay.
They didn't have, they just got to be so popular that they would just franchise and just start another one. Nowadays, you go to Movie 16 and they have two screens next door to each other doing exactly the same show. Same concept. They were so good they couldn't seat more people. So they just simply opened another theater somewhere else. And I don't know that they were running the same show, but I know that they were the same theater organization. They did standard theater. And then there was one called the Vaudeville. This one is the one that strikes legend. Robert Ripley, believe it or not, rides again. The Vaudeville was a tiny theater facing City Hall from the west. Now, if you can visualize this, on the corner is the Spanish governor's palace. And then there's some things along the way before you get over to Nueva or Dolorosa, whatever that street is. In there, facing City Hall, was a place called the Vaudeville Theater. And it was a variety house. They did not do drama, variety only. And they did this so early that they developed a format. So they opened with a razzle-dazzle thing, and then they had the sweet singer, and then they had the juggling act, and then they had the quartet, and then a comedy act, and close of the first act, and then the sweet singer came back and did something, and then a magician did an act and whatever, and then the second to last one was always the big act of the evening. And then the people were putting on the coats and the hats and whatever, and they were leaving during the last act so they could go catch the streetcar or whatever to go home. And it was such a format that other people started adopting it, and people started describing shows anywhere else in the country as in, this is a vaudeville show. This is a vaudeville offering, meaning like the one in San Antonio. And that's where we got the name vaudeville for that American institution. It came from San Antonio, from the name of that theater.
And when they said vaudeville, there was an expectation as to the format then. Everybody knew
and it started there.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you know, so people say, oh, I remember vaudeville. Is, you know, back with burlesque and all that. Well, sure, you remember vaudeville. Almost nobody within living memory here dealt with it as a vaudeville theater because it was gone early. I mean, I'm having to guess, but I would think that by the time 1900 came, it was gone. But there are photographs of it. Vaudeville Theater, this sort of rounded sign with vaudeville there above the entrance. Couldn't have been a big place. You know, seat 100, 200 maybe. Well, more. Turner Hall. That's like trying to put your finger on a drop of mercury. You remember that game? Can't do it. Turner Hall was in any number of places, and it was always, in those early days, theatrical. One unfortunate location, Turner Hall had a theater with a stage that was really just a raised platform with the wings and the dressing rooms and things off to the sides of the stage. On the other side of the stage, behind the backdrop, was a bowling alley. So that you would be sitting watching Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, and you'd hear rumble, 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 you know, and the pins would fall apart. People learned to put up with that because they were getting theater. So go to Turner Hall to bowl, or you go to Turner Hall to listen to the bowling while you're watching a show.
It would have been great for The Tempest.
Oh, yeah, but not many shows would adapt themselves that easily. They were evidently right there by the Empire at one time. Of course, they were not in the Empire. I'm going to talk about that later. They were also up just east of the Alamo on Houston Street. It was later a mortuary science, or mortuary in my time. That's where a funeral parlor was, but it had been Turner. Turner also had space, evidently, over on Commerce. I don't know if they lost the lease or they just never owned it. I don't know what it was, but the Turner operation was really considered to be theatrical, not just entertainment. They did have entertainment, but the manager of Turner was related to kin to the manager of the Plaza or the manager of the Palace. So it was not sibling rivalry, but family competition. And they all knew. All 8 of these knew each other, cooperated with each other. This was not cutthroat competition. Then there was the Plaza, the Edna Park Players. That's the name that I couldn't pick up a while ago. Edna Park. She and her husband operated the Plaza, and it was in the northwest corner of Old Josky's, now Dillard's. And it was on the ground floor. Personal connection, wouldn't you know? This whole taping is turning out to be the theatrical reminiscences of rather than the history of. The Plaza was distinguished maybe throughout Texas and maybe throughout the Southwest for being the only theater that had restroom accommodations for children. Now, I had a babysitter, a cousin, who was considerably older. She loved movies. And in order to get her to babysit with me, they would tell her that they would give her the money to go see a movie, because they showed movies there during the week in the day, and then Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, it was theatrical. Anyway, Dorothy, Dot, would say, okay, she would take care of me if they would let her go see a movie. Well, the one that she liked most was that one because it had the child-size accommodations in the restrooms. There was never any problem about taking care of me because it was all the right size. I remember the theater. I do not remember the stage. I don't remember the boxes. I don't remember the balcony. I don't remember the films. I don't remember anything. But I remember the bite-sized furniture. Really just, the commode was about that high. It's just charming. And I wonder whatever became of that. Some secondhand or antique dealer could make $1 million on it now.
I'm sure.
Well, the Edna Park Players, to get back to serious things, would do a show for a week usually, and then send that group on the road. And there was a circuit. And I'm lying, folks. This is not literally true, but make your own adjustments. San Antonio, Del Rio, El Paso, San Angelo, back to San Antonio. It was roughly a box. Mm-hmm. And it was roughly west and northwest. So they would play a week here and move to Del Rio and play a week. Meanwhile, a new show was starting here. Then it moved to Del Rio. Del Rio moved to El Paso, and a new show started here. And then it would move from El Paso to San Angelo. That's the one I'm uneasy about. I don't know that it's San Angelo. It may have been Abilene. Anyway, and a new one would open here, and then it would go on the road, and that troupe would rehearse, be performing wherever that was, and come back and rehearse their show and open the new show. So they really had roughly 4 companies, all professional, all being paid out of box office, out of, obviously, you know. So we had...
I wanted to ask you about that. All these theaters in San Antonio, were the actors, you say professional? They literally made their sole living, sole source of income by acting and directing?
Theater only.
That's amazing.
Well, it's amazing to us because we can't even support one.
We just have community theater, yes.
We have 1 million people here, and we can't support one professional theater.
Yes.
Back then, 60,000 people, and we had 7 or 8 of them going, full time. Of course, they had time off. I'm making this up. This is not literally true. We didn't have many schools. We had only San Antonio High, which became Maine High, and then later it became Fox Tech. And then later we had Brackenridge. But some of those people did what we would now think of as community outreach, storytelling and things at the Carnegie Library, that kind of stuff. But no, they were full-time, and they were expected to work full-time.
And so would professional actors come to San Antonio to live and to work?
Yeah. Well, Eddie Albert, Clark Gable and his first wife. I understand they had some epic battles that you could hear the battles from out front. Well, later they all denied it. I wrote to Eddie Albert specifically. I got his agent's address and wrote to him in care of the agent asking if he would like to make a statement of any kind about acting as part of the troupe in San Antonio or as a Toby troupe actor up and down the river. Because he also worked from Del Rio, Laredo, Roma, Reynosa, Brownsville, and back up. I don't think he ever got as far north as El Paso. Mr. Albert has no comment. I just thought you'd like to know.
Early in his acting career, what years again? Was it this
Well, he was in his 20s or 30s, and he's, what, 80 now? 50 years ago, before World War II.
Yes.
The Palace, that was one of the great traumatic experiences for me. The Palace was off a tunnel, a passageway, 20 feet wide and 15 feet high, that connected Alamo Plaza with Navarro Street, or Presa, one of those. And it had showcases along the way. People were putting in displays and things, but you come to a certain place, and here was the box office, and turn to your left coming from Alamo Plaza. Turn to the left and go into the theater. They had a second box office down on the other end, so you could go to the other box office and buy your ticket and go in. I always knew it as a movie house, but it had been a theater. Oh, talk about professional. They had their own resident, full-time paid orchestras. They didn't have tape. Don Galvan, I went to high school with his daughter. She claimed to be his niece because he wasn't married. Anyway, he was the director of that orchestra, and that was a full orchestra. This is not 4-piece, not piano, bass, drums, and a director. Paid for also by the people who ran the theater. It was a going business. Of course, this is so alien to us now that we just can't believe it.
They had a full orchestra to underscore their production.
Before and between the acts and mood music as necessary.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It really is.
Well, the reason that Palace is so hurtful to me is that it was built as a vaudeville house. Now, there were real theater productions going there, but its design was vaudeville. and it was all but unique. I got to be a quoted consultant. A woman in Austin was doing a PhD on the architecture of theater in San Antonio, well, in Texas, central Texas. And the only thing that she knew of that the man had done in San Antonio was the Palace. Local newspapers didn't have the information she needed. They had a lot of stuff about what played there and whatever, but she needed other stuff. And she couldn't find anybody. And finally somebody said about the Theater Archive. She called me and said, I need an eyewitness account of what it looked like from inside. She said, there are no photographs of the inside of the Palace Theater. And I asked, who sent you to me? And she gave me a name. And I said, how did that happen? And she told me it was one of these 3-bounce things. And got to me, and I said, well, you couldn't have asked a better one. When the Laurence Olivier films, Hamlet and Henry V, were doing their road tour before they opened as a regular theater, there was only one place in town that had numbered seats in a film house, the Palace, because it had been a vaudeville house with the numbers on the arms. The Majestic, numbered seats, forget it. The Texas, no way. Aztec, nothing else. But the Palace had it. Now I'm going to get to use my hands, folks. The auditorium of the Palace Theater downstairs looked like a regular theater. There was a sloping floor and the stage semicircular with real footlights, lights along the edge of the stage, the lip of the stage. And if you sat downstairs, there was a ceiling which was slightly slanted to go with the floor, but never close enough to be oppressive. You know, a good high ceiling, with architectural decoration underneath, so that there were rosettes and carvings and colored relief under the balcony, so that you'd sit downstairs and you would swear that you were in the theater all by yourself. There was no sense of anybody else. Take the stairway and go upstairs. You came out onto a more severely raked auditorium with a semicircular rail at the foot of the balcony. You could sit up there and never have a sense of the audience underneath. The sight lines from upstairs were aimed exactly at that stage. You had to sit on the front row with the bar, and I did it. Sit on the front row and then look down in order to see any of the theater people downstairs. There was never any visual contact with the audience downstairs. So you had two separate theater, really, two separate theater groups sitting in the same place. And of course in San Antonio, the vaudevillians used to say, you play to the balcony. Well, strangely enough, I can't verify this, folks. I do not have documentation. The story goes that the downstairs seats were less expensive than the upstairs seats, so that all of the people with the furs and the whatever would come and take the upstairs seats because of this absolutely wonderful, easy viewing of that semicircular stage. The balcony was semicircular. The stage was semicircular, so that you had maybe the idea, maybe, like an orchestra pit. And that was about all that you were aware of. Wonderful. Now, why is it painful? I loved it. I saw it only as a movie house. I never saw a stage production there. But I used to take people there and actually pay the ticket. They were not expensive. And say, we want to look at the auditorium. Buy 2 tickets and go in and look at all of the decorations and look at the thing. And the film's going on, Humphrey Bogart on film. And we'd walk upstairs and walk down the aisles and look and whatever, and wide aisles so that we weren't interfering with people seeing the screen. and go. A friend of mine came to town, and I said, there's a theater you have to see. Okay. So I took him in my car, and we parked down there on Presa. And he said, where is this thing? And I said, it's on or just off of a tunnel over there. And I said, and we're going to go, and I pointed, and at the time that I pointed, the wrecking ball hit the balcony, and the balcony caved in onto the space below, and I sat there dumbfounded with a friend that I couldn't explain anything to, watching my theater fall down because of this multi-thousand-pound wrecking ball had just hit that balcony in the center and just caved it in on there. I was distraught. I went home, just said, fend for yourself. I'm sorry, I'm going home. With a cold pack on the head.
What is there now? That is
Just open space.
just open space.
Okay. And then, I'm going to go back to the Hispanics for a moment. The Nacional Theater. There were two on the same location. The first one was taken down before my memory, and then the Nacional that I knew was at the corner, the foot of Commerce Street and Santa Rosa, right there by the beginning of El Mercado. Mm-hmm. It was a very special place. I'm talking about the first one. In the balcony, instead of regular seats, they had love seats. 2 by 2 by 2 by 2, all over the balcony. And the young women, chaperoned, would come with their boyfriends, and the only place that they could be together without society's disapproval was in the balcony at the Nacional, because all of the chaperones would sit behind them on the top row, and they would go and sit 2 by 2 by 2 by 2. I think that is a cultural marvel. I can't imagine society now. They had real theater, imported, some from Spain, not much, from Mexico, certainly, and again, professional. This was not put together by mother's loving hands at home. This was not amateurish stuff. I cannot name any of the stars who came here, but I know they were doing classic Spanish theater. Calderon and Lope de Vega and 2 or 3 others. There's a Mexican playwright who went from Mexico to Spain and became a great playwright, very popular. Tirso de Molina is one, and they were doing those shows at the Nacional. They were also doing Mexican vaudeville. The troops usually traveled in tents, los caperos. It was really vaudeville in a tent. Well, those vaudeville troops considered the Nacional to be roughly the Palace in New York. So they'd travel in their tents all over South Texas and whatever, but if they got to play La Nacional, wow, they had really made big time. Cantinflas played there, and Pedro Gonzalez, big Mexican stars, and they call her Doña Sara Garcia, Sarita, the great old lady of Mexican film. She played the old lady in films for 40 years. She must have started when she was 30. And she was always Stella Dallas. She was always the long-suffering whatever, the mother who stood at the door and watched the son march off to get killed in the revolution. Sarita played here. That's one. The second one, same location, was enlarged. I mean, it's simply designed to hold more people. And it was primarily a film house. It also did vaudeville, but it was primarily film. That's the one I knew. Before I move on, there was a San Antonio Civic Opera at the Sunken Garden. Now, they did operettas mostly. musicals as we know them hadn't been invented yet. You know, the modern musical came from Oklahoma in 1950. So these were Lehar and Sigmund Romberg and whatever, light opera. They did some serious opera, the lighter of the serious operas. And they did evidently some actual stage work like Ferenc Molnar, the Guardsman, comedy, costume stuff. People wanted spectacle at the Sunken Garden. By the way, it used not be called the Sunken Garden. It had another name. It was called something like the Bluebonnet Bowl. Some ghastly name before it took on the generic name. There was an Aurora Theater. And so far as I know, I'm the only person who ever developed any documentation on that. Right now, this moment, in my car, there is a camera. I have carried a camera with me for the last 25 years. Always accessible. I was downtown doing something else, who knows? And I looked up, and a building had been razed, R-A-Z-E-D, folks. And when it fell away, it revealed a wall that had been protected so that the paint hadn't weathered, I'm going to call it that, rather than bleached. When it fell away, up there on the wall, there was this big sign. It said, Teatro Aurora, C, letter C, C. Munoz, proprietor. Well, I got my camera and took a picture of it, which is now in the archive, and immediately started asking around. We had the Nacional, we had the Zaragoza, we had the Obrero, we had the Guadalupe. Tell me about the Aurora. Blank wall. So I went to the city directories and found out that there had been a theater there under the direction, the proprietorship of C. Munoz. It was next door to the Nacional. So at one time, you could go to the Zaragoza, or next door to the Nacional, or go around the corner to the Aurora. And evidently straight theater. Nobody ever documented that. I mean, if it hadn't been for the photograph, we wouldn't have known to look.
Amazing.
Majestic 1. That's not where it is now, folks. Where it used to be is now a parking lot facing the Rand building. And the Rand building used to be Wolf and Marks, that red building down on Houston Street, about 2 blocks west of the river. Stowers Furniture Company, big, tall building. There was a theater in there called the Majestic. And my first theatrical memory comes from the Majestic. That Majestic. One memory only. I'm talking history first. When the new Majestic opened, the one that we now call the Majestic, they didn't want to be called Majestic and New Majestic. So the old Majestic changed its name to the State, S-T-A-T-E, the State Theater. And for a while it continued with stage vaudeville, variety, a few mainliners, what do you call them? Headliners. And then it became a film house, and then it fell into disrepute and double features, and then slightly sleazy, and finally it was just simply torn down. And then the building, the Stowers building, was torn down, and now it's just one square block of nothing. Now, the first Majestic, Jolson, Eddie Cantor, Sophie Tucker, so you know the kind of entertainment that came in there.
What was the general time period of that first Majestic, when it opened and when it closed, to make way for the new Majestic?
I would think from World War I, and the new Majestic opened in the late 20s, so it was probably there 15, 20 years. Maybe more. I can't account for that. I have another personal connection with the old Majestic. My father did a comic walk-on brought down the house, and they told him that if he'd come back, they'd pay him every time he did it.
I always wondered about that, John. In the movie with Paul Newman, Judge Roy Bean, he supposedly made the trip from Langtree, the town he named after Lily Langtree, to San Antonio to see Lily Langtree perform. Was that the old Majestic?
If it was at the Majestic, it would have been at the old Majestic. Mm-hmm. But more than likely, it would have been either the Beethoven Hall or the Grand Opera. Mm-hmm. Those were the two more likely candidates, okay. But possibly the old Majestic. My father's walk-on, he was working for a local company, and they asked him to make a delivery. And he got to the stage door, and the man guarding the stage door said, yeah, you go through that door, and they'll take care of it. My father didn't understand which door. He opened the door onto the set, and carrying this package, walked right through the middle of something like a Noel Coward comedy and out the other door. The people on stage didn't know what to do with that. Of course, they were too pro to break. I mean, they just let it happen. And whatever, the audience went berserk. They thought it was one of the funniest things, surrealistic theater, anti-realistic at a time that nobody ever thought to do it that way. And he got off the other side mortified. He had just ruined the show. And the man met him on the other side and took the thing and signed the receipt. And as he was getting ready to leave, stage manager said, I want your name and address and your telephone number and your blood type and the whole blooming bit. And he said, I didn't mean to do it. And he said, it didn't have anything to do with mean to do it. If you'll come back and do that every time at the same time, we will pay you. Now, this is back in ancient days. We will pay you $5 a performance. Now, in those days, $5 was like $50 now, or maybe more. And he said no. You know, so my father did a comic walk-on at the Old Majestic. There was some local production, but mostly tours, and then I told you it was mostly film. Next is the Empire. We are getting a great deal of attention for the Empire now because of the McCombs family. Salute them. I mean, if they can do that, they deserve praise all over the place. It's the Empire. I am told, again, I have no documentation on this, I have the photograph of the first one, and I have a photograph of the second one, and there is no print connection between the two. Evidently, the Empire was built on the site of a former theater building, which was not a theater. It was called Risch's, R-I-S-C-H-E, Risch's Opera House, which was variety only. It was not opera. And they didn't do, so far as I know, any real theater. But that thing came down, and the Empire went up around 1911, 1913 as a theater. All the seats and the dressing rooms and whatever, and performed, again, personal connection. About 10, 15 years ago, I don't know how we made the connection. I literally do not remember. But I made connections with a man who called himself Chuck Gregory, Charles Gregory. He had gone to Main Avenue High School around the time that my mother was there. He didn't remember her, and she certainly didn't remember him, and the yearbooks don't show it. Anyway, he dropped out of Tech, or Maine, because he had gotten a job as a chorus boy at the Empire. Between regular shows, film or otherwise, they had what they called tab shows, T-A-B. Never less than 32 and never more than 42 minutes. And that included choreography and scenery and some sort of a microscopic plot and singing and dancing and whatever. And they needed chorus boys. And he thought that would be fun. High school kid, and it offered money. So he went. And he said that by the time that he got there, the the theatrical productions had already almost stopped. Now we're talking around World War I, give or take. but they were still doing the tab shows. And they would run, for instance, a Valentino show, and then the tab show would be not Oriental, but Near Eastern, Arabic, and all that stuff, the belly dancing and whatever. Or they would do a Lillian Gish show about the French Revolution, and the entire tab thing would be in French costumes and whatever. Elaborate productions, professional. They paid a choreographer, they paid a costumer, they paid all this sort of stuff, and all the people in the chorus. Well, Chuck, as he wanted me to call him, I was never comfortable with that. He was an old man. He was 80. This is about 10, 15 years ago. I didn't feel comfortable calling him Chuck, sorry. And I was even uneasy with Charles. You know, Mr. Gregory sounded just right to me. Anyway, he moved from the chorus to assistant choreographer in a very brief time. And maybe by the end of the first year, he was the choreographer at the Empire, choreographing all of the tab shows. Then, as a choreographer, he said, I can't choreograph these things unless I know what kind of costumes. So if you don't mind, I'm going to design the costumes for each tab show. Well, they did that, and they paid him extra. And they made costumes for each new show each week. Try that. You're theater people. You get yourself 8 chorus girls and 8 chorus boys and several leads and build costumes for all of those once a week. You know, sometimes Arabic, sometimes Chinese, sometimes American Indian, sometimes South Seas. And he said that he couldn't really work with the costumes unless he could coordinate it with the set. So if they didn't mind, he wanted to do the set design too. Good enough. So he got to do set design, and they paid him extra for that. Are you...
So the movie would run for 1 week. Let me get this straight. The movie would run for 1 week, and in that week they would have a new set, all new costumes, choreography, and it would be a show from 32 to 42 minutes.
That's right.
Amazing.
Better than that. So he was doing costuming, set design. Oh, but you need to understand about set design, folks. These were mostly cut out. Mm-hmm. So this is a tree. You know, this is a hut for the natives and whatever. They didn't have realistic sets, but they had sets. And staircases and lighting, special lighting, blue for this and red for that, and this on, and Queen of the Stardust Ballroom glitter balls. Well, he was so good that the Aztec hired him. See, the Aztec used to do stage shows. I have seen stage shows at the Aztec. That was much later, but they were still going. And he went to the Aztec where he had total control of the tab shows. He would select whatever. The Aztec people, and that was interstate theaters, would choose the film and announce maybe a month or 6 weeks in advance the name of the film. And by that time, he had assistant costumers and assistant everythings, and he would do the drawings. I have seen these in great folios, great work portfolios. This was the designs that we did for the Arabian show. This is the design we did for the Eskimo show, and whatever. And he did that, and he sent his resume to the Howard, which is in Boston, just as a chance, the way you'd take a chance on the Texas lottery. And they hired him. Without an interview, they hired him. So he left San Antonio and didn't come back until 40, 50 years later. Thank you, Nora Dusen Hill. And he came back old, no longer choreographing, no longer doing that, living on the scrapbooks and the memories. But he couldn't leave theater. So he developed a magic act, and he always hired a girl, and it had to be a girl, 18, so that she could travel with him to do these magic shows. And he was touring military camps, installations, and he'd go and do a magic show, and he needed her for styling. She'd wear the brief costume and hand him the fish bowl, stuff. And Chuck did that until he got in a car wreck. He ran into a train. and it damaged him, but didn't really stop him. As soon as he was up and around again, he was doing his magic show. And then he got cancer, and that was the end of that. And he told me that I could have all of his scrapbooks, all of everything for the theater archive. And I got some of them from him immediately when he said that. And they are in the archive. Patterns of choreography. This is where they go first, and this is what they do, and this is where they stand. And some costume design. And he said, you can have it all. He opened the door and showed me the closet. He said, here they are. Stacks of, I'm going to call them portfolios and scrapbooks. And then he died. And I didn't want to be pushy. So I waited maybe 3 weeks and called his brother, whom I had met there, identified myself, and he said, oh yes, I remember. I said, Mr. Gregory said that I could have all of his scrapbooks and all the portfolios for the theater archive as a memorial. And he said, oh no, that stuff was no good. We went through it and it was just junk, so we threw it out. So that's gone. I thought I'd mention that.
There's a question about the tab shows, John. Was that something that originated in San Antonio, or did they do that in all the...
The tab shows?
Tab
oh no, they were all over.
All over. And how long, what was the era of tab shows?
Film. When they started shipping films around to be shown in film houses, some of those films ran only 20 minutes. You know, some of those chaplains are 18 to 20-minute films.
Right.
So they would show a chaplain, and they didn't want to say, pay your full admission. So they'd give them the film and a tab show, and the people would go home satisfied. They'd had something.
And so with the advent of sound in films, the
no,
tab
no,
shows...
No, silence. The silent films, primarily.
But what I mean, when films then had sound, did the tab shows just kind of disappear?
Yeah.
They did? Okay.
Yeah. But people traveled in tab shows. Touring tab shows were another matter. For instance, Eva Le Gallienne, Alla Nazimova, Ethel Barrymore actually traveled the country doing tabs because they were less demanding. Remember, 32 to 42 minutes. And they were the star. And it would say, Ethel Barrymore in Captain Jinks. And people would go to see Ethel Barrymore, and what they would get is a Dorothy Gish film, Ethel Barrymore for 32 minutes, and go home. So the tabs were a national institution. Most of them were local productions, but some of the big stars traveled, toured them. Well, to continue. The Aztec, the one built like the great Middle American temple with the carvings of the demonic gods. People say Aztec, but it's a blend. It's a whole bunch of things. It isn't just Aztec. But they called it the Aztec Theater. That was a film house most of the time that I knew it. But I saw Rosita, you know, the great San Antonio lady who always sings about San Antonio. Rosita did a show there. Victor Mature came, and there was a show going at the Majestic on stage, the new Majestic. So he couldn't get in there. The Texas was busy for some reason or other. So the stage show moved into the Aztec. They had dressing rooms, and they had the flies and the whatever. It was a real theater. But in the last 50 years of its existence, it was film. Then the Texas, another great sadness. You can see the facade of the Texas on Houston Street, facing south. That bank destroyed it. Pure vandalism, cultural vandalism. They did not need to destroy it. They chose to destroy it. Originally, it was the Bexar County National Bank, then it became the Republic Bank, then it became First Republic, and then it became something else, and then the NCNB, North Carolina National Bank, which is now Nations Bank. Well, at least Nations Bank didn't do it. NCNB did it. They came in and decided that theater has to go. It had 600, 800 seats. The acoustics were miraculous. I have never known of another theater that could do that. The old thing about striking the match on stage, and you hear it in the top row of the balcony, literally true. No microphones, no sound equipment. You could hear people on stage turn the page of a book when it makes that little sort of scratching sound. You could hear it. The bank said they tore it down because they couldn't refurbish it. The acoustics were so dreadful that they couldn't use it, and they were going to have to put in $1 million worth of sound equipment, and it wasn't worth it, and business people would be uncomfortable being in a theater, and yammer, 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 which is pure black rot. They also wouldn't let people in with cameras, because along the two walls were a mural. It was about, I'm going to say 15 feet high and 80 feet long on each side, murals by a man named Mora, and he was the teacher of Porfirio Salinas, the great painter whose paintings sell for jillions. And they wouldn't let people in to take pictures of the mural, because when they destroyed it, then they would have to explain what they had done, and if there are no photographs to prove that it was there, rotters, R-O-T-T-E-R-S. If that's libel, sue me. They took it down. Now, it was the great place. My earliest theater going, except for my one memory of the state, are from the Texas. And I want to talk about that one memory from the state. My mother and Mrs. Wolf's Inn, used to go to the theater once a week. And when the kids got old enough, the kids got to go along. Well, for some reason or other, there was a show, and it had dancing girls. My first theatrical memory of dancing girls, with the tights and the tutus and whatever. And they came out in front of that glittering curtain. Do you remember those curtains they used to hang? And the lights from behind the audience on the curtains made them glitter, either gold or pink or whatever. They were just magic. Well, this line of chorus girls in front of the curtain were doing a kick line. And every time they kicked, the drummer did his little do. And I, idiot 5-year-old child, did not know that there was a drummer down there doing that. To me, every time they kicked, they made that sound. So they would go, the legs would go up and pow, and they'd do this thing and pow, and I kept hearing this, and I thought that was just wonderful. So when it was over with, we came out, and we were walking along the sidewalk, going back to the parking lot, and this lunatic child, 5 years old, started doing high kicks out on the sidewalk. As in, what are you doing? I'm trying to make that sound. What sound? I'm trying to make that sound. And I did this high kick, high kick, high kick, and I could never make that sound. Well, they thought I was nuts, and I didn't understand why I couldn't make that sound. Every time the girls did it, pow. Every time I did it, nothing. So I got home, and my father said, and what did you do today? And I said, we saw these dancing girls, and they did like this, and I did my high kick, and I was very unhappy because I couldn't make that sound. My memory of the Texas Theater. The Majestic #1. Now, the Texas. The stars toured. Sometimes they used locals for bit roles, not supporting roles, bit roles. The company toured. And that's where I saw Helen Hayes, Tallulah Bankhead, Mae West, Eugenie Leontovich, Akim Tamirov, Frederick March, Catherine Carnell, Jose Greco in a very unusual show because there was no plot. Jose Greco just came out and danced. Stars of that kind in standard plays, as in The Carn is Green, That Lady, Catherine Carnell, Diamond Lil for Mae West, Tallulah Bankhead and her great touring favorite, the private lives. And tickets were cheap in the balcony. I don't remember ever paying more than $1.25. And remember, they didn't need amplification, so that if I got there early, I could get a seat in about the second or third row lower balcony for $1.25, folks. And right down there was Tabula Lunkhead, or right down there was Akim Tamirov, or Sophie Tucker, or Sidney Greenstreet, or name it. We had them.
Is this when San Antonio was on the tour stop as one of the major cities?
Oh, yeah. That we were number 4.
And what were the other cities?
I'm glad you brought that up. For a long time, it ended with World War II, folks, except that the Texas went on after World War II. Shows started at the Hippodrome in New York. It had roughly a 70-foot stage, maybe 80, big. From the Hippodrome, they simply packed up everything, including the scenery, and moved it to the Howard in Boston. That's where Chuck Gregory went later. And they cut it because the Howard, I'm going to say, had a 60-foot stage, so they could do a little compacting. Well, from there, the next stop was New Orleans, and they did that by water rather than by train. Water was a great deal cheaper, about 1/2 the price of rail. So they could put things on a boat ship in Boston and bring it around to New Orleans for half the price it would have taken overland. And they brought it into the Grand Opera House in New Orleans, the big one. And it's smaller. So they maybe had to cut 5 feet off it. Well, from there, they brought it by rail, Sunset Limited, from New Orleans to San Antonio. So we were the 4th place.
No stop in Houston.
No stop in Houston. Forget it. Houston was a salt bog. I mean, it just didn't get anywhere until about 10 years ago. So from the Hippodrome to the Howard to the New Orleans Theater, I'm assuming that it was a Grand Opera, and then to the Grand Opera here, which again was a smaller stage, so they had to cut it. Then from here, it went north to St. Louis first, and then to Chicago, from Chicago to Denver, and from Denver to San Francisco. And San Francisco's Opera House is one of the glories of the world, but it has a fairly small stage, so they had to cut it one more time. And when they got through there, they just junked it. When they got through with that set, forget it. They burned it or chopped it up or painted it and used it for something else. And the troupe then would go back to New York, to the Hippodrome, and start again. So those tours were going on, but they didn't come to the Texas.
How long would the tour take once it started in New York and ended in San Francisco?
I'm going to say however long the run was in the Hippodrome, it ran. Then transition time, and it would run for a week or two at the Howard. Then it would run for a week or two, not counting transition time, from Boston to New Orleans. That might have taken a week. Then a week or two in New Orleans, then a week or two here. And then transition time. They were playing a week or two each, so I would think it would take 3 or 4 months. Everywhere, you know, everybody. George Burns. Well, there was the Green Gate, which is at the location of what is now La Mansión del Rio, the one on College Street there right at the river. Mm-hmm. Yeah. See, St. Mary's University had the property behind St. Mary's Church and let them have the space. And it was really a green gate through which you had to go to get in. The Green Gate players were there. They were not professional. Maybe the staff was paid, but the performers, including Henry Guerra folks, they performed there, and it was just occasionally. Then there were the Temple players who worked with Temple Bethel, and then that died when they sort of combined with the very earliest manifestation of San Antonio Little Theater. The people who had been in the Temple players including Florence Lieb. I think you know her from Speech Arts.
Okay.
Okay. And Betty Sachs, the legendary director, and several others were with the Temple Players, and they went over to the Little Theater to play with Nora Dusenhill. Okay. Then there was the Music Box, which is to me purely Alice Down the Rabbit Hole or Over the Rainbow. It was upstairs in what was called the Irish Flats. If you're new to San Antonio, you do not know the Irish Flats. North and slightly northeast of the old post office downtown, where 37 now goes through and Nolan cuts across. That used to be an Irish settlement. Hundreds of houses are in there. You can still see some of the old ones on Alamo. You can still see some of them on some of those other streets. They have been preserved. But there were lots of more temporary than that. They weren't the great thick walls. And the Music Box was down in that area upstairs. So you came and opened the door, and here was this flight of stairs going up. And it was bijou, very small musical entertainments. I knew one of the actresses who had performed there. What she did there was negligible, really. But she went to the San Antonio Little Theater and did all of the roles that Gene Eagles had played in New York and on film. Lucy Richardson Hamilton. Fantastic actress, and she just died about 4 years ago. Very special lady. She encouraged me to encourage her to come out of retirement, and we were going to do, the subject was roses. And I had the son picked. She was going to play Mama. We were looking for a man to play her husband, strong enough to play against her, strong lady, like Tallulah. I mean, a really strong lady. And we couldn't negotiate for the man and the time when the others could do it. And we postponed it, and then she died. And it's a personal loss to me, but it's also a theatrical loss because we didn't get to see her come out of retirement after 35 years to do a role in Subject Was Roses. Which brings us to 1940. You know, at this rate, we should be here till August. My memories begin to overlap. I was not a free agent, that is, just to be able to go anywhere, get on the bus and go, or encourage people to drop me off until after this. I got into the Texas. I was permitted that. And of course, my cousin Dot used to take me to see films, but that wasn't the same. As soon as I could on my own, I started scrounging up the money so that I could go to the Texas to see real people do real things. And I don't know where that came from. My people are not theatrical. My mother danced in the chorus when she was in high school. My father did a comic walk-on. But that's not theatrical people. And I was avid. And my peers, my school chums, were not. You know, so it wasn't a matter of my gang. I was doing it. The only time I ever played hooky from high school, I did it for theater. I had been such a model student. All of the teachers evidently just thought I was all right. And I was always there. I was always prompt. I was always prepared. I did well. And every now and then I would go to the library and help the librarian rather than go through some more of that drill and some of those other classes. And the teacher didn't mind. We had little slips, and the teacher would sign it. Okay, you can go to the library. And sometimes I would just go to the library and come back and say, I was at the library, and nobody ever complained. Or I'd go help with the yearbook. And the librarian thought that was okay. So I could be either at the library or working on the yearbook or helping with the journalists or overhearing everything going on in the drama department. Nobody monitored me. One day I wanted to see something at the Texas. So at lunch, instead of going back to class, I walked down the street, caught the bus, went to the Texas, saw the show, came back, and was there for the final bell. Walked out with the others. Nobody ever challenged me. To this day, not one of those teachers or anybody ever asked me, where were you? Because I had always been right there. But I think it's significant. It's the only time I cut. The only time I
Do you
played
remember for
hooky.
what show that was?
It wasn't a biggie for me. It might have been Frederick March. Anyhow, it
That's a
didn't.
pretty good reason.
It didn't capture me. I mean, yeah, I mean that's great, but you know, it wasn't, for instance, something I was avid to see. But I was avid enough to cut class. No, I don't remember. I'll remember later. Oh, Maria Uspenskaya. Do you remember her?
No.
The Russian character actress who always had the diamond fixed here in her navel. In her nostril. She was the Rani in The Rain's Game, the great film with Tyrone Power. I mean, she was big stuff, and it was a costume drama of some sort, and I didn't care much. Well, 1940s. We're back to that. We had the community players here under the directorship primarily of Gene Longworth, who is still around, ill, but still around. When San Antonio Little Theater shut down, time that World War II started, the board simply decided, no, we're not going to do that. And they shut the doors. San Antonio Little Theater was gone. And the community players stepped in because they already had the mechanism, they had the director, they had the cast, they had the volunteers and whatever. And they didn't believe that San Pedro Playhouse should stand empty. If it stands empty, other people are going to start taking advantage. There are going to be religious groups coming in, and Boy Scouts are going to start holding conventions, and commercial ventures are going to take over, and there are going to be industrial shows and whatever, and they didn't think that should happen. So they moved in, and they kept it going until after the war, when Joe Salick came. Now, some of the directors for the community players, Gene Longworth, I have already talked about, J.C. Roberts, and Frank Beckwith. These names don't mean anything to anybody, but they've written books about theater, and this is mentioned. San Antonio is mentioned in their books. They weren't from here. They came here and did this and then went on to New York or Chicago or Denver or Oshkosh. SALT reopened. 3 people were hired, that is Milton Ling, Will Hussung, who is still with us, living here in Alamo Heights, came back to San Antonio after 50 years in a professional theater in New York, and Albert Lacoste. They were hired to find an artistic director for SALT, and they chose Joe Salick. And Joe Salick was introduced to San Antonio on the stage of the Arneson River Theater. I was working at the public library at the time. I was a student, but I was working at the public library at the time. And there was this great hoopla because the public library is where the Hertzberg is, and it's very close to Arneson. Mm-hmm. And one of the students had been going to San Antonio College, which was just across the river. See, San Antonio College wasn't where it is now. It was on Alamo. Came in, having come through that way, and she said, there's a big hoop to do going on the Arneson Theater, and it has something to do with theater. So I immediately asked my boss, Rosemary, what's her name, could I take off 30 minutes for my coffee break? And she said, well, yeah, okay, it's slow anyway. So I went over, and I got to see Joe Salick being introduced to San Antonio. A sailor shirt with the square thing here, and the sailor pants, and the sandals, and a rope tied around the middle. You know, theatrical beyond anything.
Backtracking just a bit, when did the San Pedro Playhouse, which was San Antonio Little Theater, when was that founded?
The Playhouse was built in the late 20s,
right.
And San Antonio Little Theater opened it. and kept it going until World War II. Then Community Players, and then about 1946, 47, anyhow, while I was still a student.
And the reason why it was called a little theater? San Antonio
Oh, it's
Little
part
Theater?
of it was part of the little theater system.
Mhm.
There were probably 1,000 little theaters all over the country.
So it was a very common name in cities to
Oh,
have a
yes,
little
and it had
theater.
nothing to do with size. It had nothing to do with quality.
Right.
What it really signified was that it was local rather than tour.
Mhm.
The serious stuff came to the big theaters, and little theater was local production with local talent and whatever.
So it kind of signified community theater.
Yeah, and it used to mean very high quality. You moved up to little theater from other community theaters, so that back then you could be, I'm going to make up names, you could be at the Rialto number 3 and you could do things at a local university and you could do whatever, but if you got actually cast at the San Antonio Little Theater, you had moved up. Well, of course, all that changed along the way. It's now just another community theater.
As a matter of fact, they recently dropped officially the little theater.
Yeah, they said that it carried the wrong connotation. That people
Right.
thought they were going to be small or not have quality. And I immediately asked them, does that mean you can't live up to little theater quality anymore?
Well, you really have to know a little bit about theater history to understand the title of Little Theater.
Well, most people who come here know about that because there are little theaters all over the country, even now. Yale, you know, that great theatrical project that they've been doing, started as Yale Little Theater.
Mhm.
And they changed its name, not because it said little, but because they wanted a more academic sound.
Right.
Yeah, well, then for a while, in 1950, give or take, 1950, 51, there was Theater San Antonio. Lily Cahill, an actress in New York, came back to San Antonio from New York. She thought it was about time that San Antonio should have professional theater. Will Hussung, whom I just mentioned, was her stage manager. They didn't have a home, so they performed at Jefferson High School. And they lasted 2 seasons. Theatrical, good stuff. Professional. They were being paid. Maybe not a great deal, but they were being paid, the only ones at the time. And maybe for a long time they were being paid. She was a cousin of Kay Cruz. And that doesn't mean anything to some people. Kay Cruz was the great character actress in San Antonio. At San Antonio Little Theater, a couple of other theaters. And she was a cousin of Laura Hope Cruz, who was the film character actress who made films with Garbo and Dietrich and Joan Fontaine and whatever. It's a theatrical group. Kay was really pretty good. Then First Repertory with Bob Swain, professional, started. It started at the corner, sort of, at the bend, where Austin Highway comes off Broadway. Right now there is a repair shop, what's it, mechanical automotive repair shop of some kind. I don't remember the name of it, but anyhow, that building is literally the building in which First Rep started. It had to be slightly rebuilt because one of the successors of First Rep started a fire. It was a cabaret, and the kitchen fire did some damage, so they had to do some stuff. But that was First Rep. And it got to be good enough and famous enough that they were filling every seat and selling out before the run started, whatever, and waiting lists 200 long. So they moved downtown to Hemisphere, which I refer to generally as Hemisflop, to the International Building on the grounds of Hemisphere. And they were there for about a year. And then Bob Swain, who had founded it, created it, carried it, managed it, supported it, enlarged the board. And there were some dissidents on the board, and they voted him out. So he lost his baby and went to Austin and has been working off and on at Zach Scott ever since. But anyway, immediately I dubbed the survivor second rep, which didn't make him happy. And somebody else ran it. And then somebody else ran it, and I called it third rep, which didn't make them happy either. And finally, it just bit the dust. And I think that was deserved. Deservedly. Okay. Then the Plaza Dinner Theater was also professional. No kin to the one that had been there before. This was on Hemisphere grounds. Just that far from the tower. Do you remember the Plaza?
It was the very first theater production I saw when I moved to San Antonio in 1975.
Okay.
At the Plaza.
They had good local productions, but they also had touring shows. Jacques Brel came in there with the touring company.
Okay. It's alive and well.
Yeah, good show. And they had the Haymakers, the little warm-up group that came out first. And one of the Haymakers was Molly Stevens, who went off to do good stuff here, and then went to Austin and still doing good stuff. Well, music theater, Elaine and Hal Curran, their entire aim in life really was to do Gilbert and Sullivan. They did other things. They did Man with a Load of Mischief. They did a Romberg. They did some Neil Simon. They did some straight shows. But generally, their real aim was to produce Gilbert and Sullivan. And they usually did 2 a summer. And they did them out at what used to be Shadowlands, and now it's Roaring Twenties, at the Whitty for about 15 years, and a couple of other places. Oh, Arneson River Theater. I saw Mikado at the Arneson River Theater, theirs. And then they moved into what had been the Italian Pavilion at Hemisphere, and worked there for a while. And then they moved from there next door to the Plaza. You may not remember that there was a thing called something like the Midnight Cowboy. Anyway, the Plaza backstage and their backstage actually joined. If you opened a door, you could be in the dressing room from the other theater. And they were there, and they made the mistake of trying to go year-round. Their real expertise was doing 2 shows a year, back-to-back, but with 3 months of preparation on one and overlap preparation for the second. Well, when they opened year-round, I mean, they were doing 8 shows a year. They couldn't do it. They simply couldn't keep up the stress, and the energy was just not there, so they died. Then there was the Lackland Little Theater, with which I was associated as consultant, script editor, whatever, and it flourished for about 5 years. They did good stuff. Canticles for Leibowitz. They did some melodrama. They did Shakespeare. That's where I was involved. Moliere. They did Tartuffe. Some pretty good stuff. Molly Bennett was their main director. And she is now in Aurora, Colorado, doing the same thing she did here. I had a Christmas card from them. We have never broken contact. Brooks Air Force Base had a theater. It was mostly readers' theater, but it did exist, and I used to deal with the director. Of course, being eventually the 15 or 20-year critic gave me some open doors that might not have happened otherwise. You know, some of this came from that. Fort Sam Theater. This is not Harlequin. Fort Sam was a converted movie house. It seated 900 people or something like that. So what they would do is run this curtain across part of it. Doesn't that sound like Sac Auditorium? Yeah, and they had a huge stage. They had something like an 80-foot stage, 80-foot proscenium.
Where in Fort Sam was this located?
About 2 blocks north of where Harlequin is now.
Since torn it down then,
Oh,
right?
yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, long gone. It was clapboard. I mean, it was put up for World War II, I think. Anyhow, it was one of those things. So when it went, Bill Larson operated it, and then he operated Harlequin for a while simultaneously, and then gone. And then the Fort Sam Entertainment Center was across the street from where Harlequin is now, the parking lot for Harlequin. It used to be the Fort Sam Houston Entertainment Center. And they did straight shows. They did The Prisoner. They did Shakespeare. They did comedy, you know, whatever. and then that got torn down, and they moved into the Harlequin. The second oldest continuing production group in San Antonio right now is Offstage, and that startles people. Judy J's Offstage is the second longest continuity in San Antonio.
After the San Pedro Playhouse, right?
After, yeah.
Yes.
Any way you care to split that. Little theaters, community players, little theater, call it whatever you want. It's the longest running, but she's second. And she's been doing quality shows, well-funded, elegantly produced. I mean, no expense spared. I know of one show that cost them $12,000 to mount, and it played for 12 shows.
And I've never seen a bad show that she
You're not going to.
Yes.
She's the class act, and still going at it. And then there was Billboard, which was down on the river where one of those Mexican restaurants is now, like the original, next door, right down there, just off Commerce Street. And it did serious theater. Again, Florence Lee.
I'm told we have 3 minutes left on tape.
3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Well, I can take care of that.
Okay, all right.
I can handle all of that.
Okay.
What we have had since all of the glory days, which I'm assuming are over, except for JJ, we now have a melodrama group going. The San Antonio Fine Arts Center has finally dwindled and gone. That was Bill Copeland and his wife. San Antonio Theater Club, Richard Rosen, that has now become Magic Theater and is still going. San Antonio Public Theater, the first one, operated out of Central Christian, and they did straight theater. They did Chekhov and Arthur Miller and Moliere and experimental shows, Charles Conwell and others. Then there was the San Antonio Theater Guild, which operated in what is now the exercise hall for St. Anne's Church at the corner of Ashby and Fredericksburg Road. Several SAC people were involved. Carl Atkins, who was in your department, Ron Lukey, who was in your department, Martha McDaniel, who was in your department, Bill Samuelson, who was the head of the language department at SAC. They did the Cane Mutiny court martial. Alamo City Theater became the church. It moved to the church. And then it moved from the church to the Josephine, and then went out of business, and it became the Josephine. 24th Street Experiment for 15 years with Rick Slocum, and then great productions, Gloria Lou. And they keep springing up all over the place. Right now, there's a show opening at the Woodlawn. The Actors Theater San Antonio moved there. But upstairs, there's a show opening with the Jenkins Entropy Productions.
Yes.
They just spring up, and sometimes they last, and sometimes they don't. That one won't, because we know he's leaving. This is a one-time shot for him. And that's about all I want to tell you about. I can tell you this much more.
Well, thank you, John. All right, the interview with John Igo, soon to be a mini-series that will be announced in one of the major networks, I'm sure.
See what happens when you have a captive audience.
But a living piece of San Antonio theater history, and something which I hope goes in the archives. A copy of this tape goes in the archives.
I wouldn't mind having one myself.
No one knows more about theater in San Antonio than John Igo. When I moved here in 1975, he and Joe Salick were the first theater people I met. And I've been very privileged to have this association all these many years.
I also saw him act.
One of the very few people, and I wish you would forget about that.
It was an Ibsen.
Yes, it was. Well,
When We Dead Awaken, something like that.
When We Dead Awaken,
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
Yes. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.